To have you with us. Lanny, you're the chief or one of the legal attorneys for the Christic Institute, and Father Bill Davis is one of the chief investigators. Could you tell us a bit about the Christic Institute and how you got involved in this investigation?
Surely. The Christic Institute is a nonprofit, interfaith, public interest law firm and public policy center, all of which is to say that we take legal cases that have a major public policy dimension. We litigate them to win. We also do the public education and organizing that's important to change the policies that created the conditions that led to the lawsuit. And now we're working on what we call the Penca case or the Contra case.
And how does this story begin?
The story really begins for us with a press conference called by Eden Pastora in the jungles of Nicaragua just across the border from Costa Rica, a location called Penca, Nicaragua. Pastora had called this press conference to denounce the Central Intelligence Agency for pressuring him to put himself under the leadership of Adolfo Calero and the FDN, the Contra force based in Honduras. Pastora had an independent Contra force in Costa Rica. He considered the FDN to be dominated by the Somoza National Guardsmen, and he wanted nothing to do with them. The CIA wanted a unified Contra command so that they could run the Contra war more efficiently. The CIA, at the end of April in 1984, had said to Pastora, you have 30 days to put yourself under the FDN command and join a unified command, or else. They did not specify what the or else was. In May 30th, 1984, Pastora called his press conference to denounce the CIA, and at that press conference was a man who called himself Per Anker Hansen, pretending to be a Danish journalist carrying an aluminum camera case. In the bottom of that aluminum camera case was a sophisticated C4 explosive device, also with shrapnel in it to make it appear more crude later when it blew up. And Hansen, who we now know is named Amak Galil, and I'll talk about him a little later, but he planted that bomb at the Pastora press conference, went outside and detonated it. 8 people were killed, 28 people were injured. Pastora escaped injury.
And the U.S. press tried to blame it on a combination of Gaddafi, the Libyans, and Nicaragua, did they not?
Actually, they said the terrorist who planted the bomb was a Basque terrorist.
A Basque, that's
from ETA
right.
in Spain, who had been working for the Nicaraguan
right.
government. One of the journalists present during the bombing, Tony Avergon, who was covering it for ABC television, was seriously injured. He is one of our plaintiffs. His wife is Martha Honey, another United States journalist working in Costa Rica. They are the 2 plaintiffs in our case. And they began an investigation as to who had done the bombing. They heard this story about the Basque terrorist working for the Nicaraguan government. They tracked it down, found out that the Basque terrorist was in fact under house arrest in France at the time and couldn't possibly have participated. But then they began to hear another story. A young man named David came to a Costa Rican, actually it's an interesting little story there. David came into a bar with a group of people. Most of the group left. He was alone. He walked up to a table to a Costa Rican who was sitting there having a beer and said, I've got to talk to somebody. And he proceeds to tell this Costa Rican carpenter, Carlos Chinchilla, a story about an international brigade based on a ranch in Costa Rica that has been engaging in terrorist activities, that was responsible for the bombing of the Pastora press conference, that is composed of representatives of the FDN and Calero, American mercenaries, American paramilitary groups, and all operating off of the ranch of a man named John Hull, a CIA operative in Costa Rica, and that they were responsible for the bombing at the Penca press conference. That they also have a plan to blow up the United States Embassy in Costa Rica and assassinate the United States Ambassador Louis Tams, blame that on the Sandinista government, and provoke an outrage in the United States and a direct U.S. military intervention against Nicaragua. Carlos happens to know some people who know Tony Avergon and Martha Honey, the journalists. He goes to those people, they get in touch with the journalists, and pretty soon David's story is being transmitted to Tony Avergon and Martha Honey. And they start to see this broader network of terrorist activity seeming to have official United States government sanction. They hold a press conference to announce the plan to bomb the embassy and kill Ambassador Tams in order to stop the plot, and do succeed in doing that. As a result, they are subject to death threats. David, their source, is later kidnapped and tortured and murdered. And they continued nonetheless their investigation. Very courageous pair of journalists. I mean, they went after the story. They didn't stop despite the threats, despite the killing of their news source. They continued their story.
And were they also the group that discovered that a drug ring was operating on John Hall's ranch in Costa Rica?
They are one of them, that cocaine was coming in major quantities out of Colombia onto John Hall's ranch, and that it was being shipped then from John Hall's ranch into the United States. Pilots bringing weapons illegally out of the United States down to John Hall's ranch for this southern front of a Contra effort were bringing the cocaine back into the United States on their airplanes. There was another whole shipping thing using shrimp boats going into Miami. At one point, they were bringing 1 ton of cocaine a week into Miami as part of the operation. Our investigation to date indicates more and more that the Contra operation they were trying to set up in Costa Rica to displace Eden Pastora and put their own in place was in fact little more than a cover for this major drug connection that they were making, Costa Rica being a perfect stopping off point from Colombia halfway going to the United States.
Now, was this done just for profit, or was it part of the way to help pay for the bills of the Contras and to get more money for the Contras, which the CIA couldn't get out of the Congress?
A lot of both. I mean, there was some of the proceeds from the sales of the drugs were used to buy additional arms, explosives, ammunition, uniforms for the Contras. Some of it went into the pockets of the people who were involved, and a lot of it, of course, went to the people selling the drugs. Pablo Escobar, Jorge Ochoa, 2 of the biggest Colombian drug lords, were the connection, the cocaine connection for the Contras. In fact, the plot to kill Ambassador Tams and bomb the Costa Rican embassy had as one side benefit for the plotters that Pablo Escobar in Colombia had put $1 million price tag on Ambassador Tams' head based on Ambassador Tams' activities in Colombia of trying to get them extradited when he was there. When he moved to Costa Rica, they put the $1 million price tag on his head. They planned to collect the $1 million from Escobar after they killed Tams and blamed Tams' death on the Sandinista government. So there are lots of different motivations all at the same time. In some cases, it's a mixture of patriotism and profiteering. In some cases, it's straight profiteering. I mean, some of the people directly involved in the drug business could care less who the client is. They're just moving drugs, making money, and getting it done. And the arms dealers as well. The arms shipments coming out of Florida were coming from major arms dealers in the United States who don't care really that much who the client is. They want to sell the arms and make the money. There was the overlay of this Contra war that gave them the vehicle for establishing this pipeline and moving their goods and supplies and making a lot of money off it.
Can you tell us how your lawsuit and documentation of these events has attempted to publicize the event?
It's important, first of all, to just say briefly the legal theory behind it, how we came to the secret team through this lawsuit. Because on the surface of it, it's simply a personal injury in Costa Rica. But rather than name as defendants the ones who were immediately involved at La Penca, we went one step further back, and we said that that injury really resulted from an illegal conspiracy within the United States, a conspiracy to open a southern front against Nicaragua. It's in violation of the Neutrality Act, in violation of the arms export, various banking laws, etc., and obviously the drug laws. And so in the lawsuit, we named some 29 individuals, a lot of whom at that time were relatively unknown, like Richard Secord, his business partner Albert Hakim, and so on and so forth. Now, why did we do that? The reason we did was that, first of all, we wanted to get back at the roots of this problem, and we wanted to use the lawsuit as a mother lode of information to the American public about what's really going on. And one of the laws invoked is the so-called RICO law. It's a racketeering law. RICO stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It was a law to get at organized crime. We said that all of these men are involved in one or the other aspect of a federal racketeering enterprise, which includes not just illegal arms sales, as has now been verified through the Iran affair that has been made public, but has for years included the use of drugs, illegal drug traffic, as a way of profiteering and funding their operations. So basically what the lawsuit is saying is that there is, in effect, a secret team or almost a shadow government that's operating, a group of international plumbers that has at least the silent approval of the government. Many of the folks in that secret team are, in fact, people who came out of government jobs, either the military or the intelligence agencies, and we feel very confident that we are going to be able to document in evidentiary form that this team of people have been, for a number of years now, dealing in arms and drugs and using the profits to carry on a foreign policy which the American people have no control over.
Can we specify some of this and talk about names
Yes.
and the history? Right now, we've talked mainly about Costa Rica, a small operation, but this, like you said, is
Right. This
worldwide and
goes
back a long way.
much larger. Let me just name some of the individuals, first of all, who are defendants. We named, of course, John Hull. We named the bomber Amak Galil. We named a number of Cuban Americans who were involved down there. But when we came back to start going upstairs, we started basically right outside the door of Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. We did not name government officials in this lawsuit. We felt it would be better if Congress would go after that, and now because of the revelations that our lawsuits made, Congress is going after that. But we took Oliver North's personal representative, a man named Robert Owen. We named him as a defendant. We named former General Richard Secord, his business partner Albert Hakim, Thomas Posey, the man who runs Civilian Military Assistance Program. He used to call it military assistance. Now that they've discovered the Neutrality Act, he's changed it to materiel assistance. General John Singlaub, former General John Singlaub, all people who purport to be in the private area, but as a matter of fact, they set up in the private area only because it has become more convenient for various political and economic reasons to do so. All of these people were involved in some rather interesting previous work with the government. Let me just give you a very brief overview of some of them. We feel that Theodore Shackley and Thomas Kleins, two of our defendants, they're former CIA agents, men who for years worked with Ed Wilson, the man who is now in jail for selling explosives and training terrorists in Libya. We really first run into them back in the 60s. Shackley was the CIA station chief in Florida, and Kleins was his chief assistant, when a program was set up to harass Castro, to try to overcome what Castro had done in Cuba. And they were sending speedboats out to burn crops and blow up bridges and that sort of thing. As a matter of fact, a little-known aspect of that program is that it was shut down because the speedboats were caught red-handed bringing drugs back. And so rather than prosecute people, what happened was it was all hushed up, and people like Shackley then moved to be CIA assistant station chief in Laos. And he took Kleins with him. He also took with him a little-known assassination team, basically. I don't know what else to call it that would be more gentle, but under the harassment of Castro, a special team was set up that was basically a shooter team. Some very interesting characters on that. Among them, people like Rolando Martinez and Frank Sturgis, some of the Watergate burglars. But also on that team was a man named Felix Rodriguez, whom Hassenfuss called Max Gomez, and whom the vice president has met with at least 3 times that we know of and calls him a great patriot. Felix Rodriguez and Posada Carillas, internationally known terrorists, were part of that original team back in the 60s. They also were used then in Laos, where a much larger drug operation got underway. There was official sanction for working with a man named Bang Pao in that area, one of the opium lords. His rivals were mysteriously assassinated so that he got a virtual monopoly on the opium trade. Some of the profits of this were banked in a CIA front, which is known as the Nugenhand Bank down in Australia. They set up assassination teams over there to train the Hmong tribesmen so that they could continue to assassinate any potential communists, the Pathet Lao, people like that. So what we see developing rather rapidly in Southeast Asia is the funding of what they call black operations, programs that they couldn't get passed through the ordinary channels, the funding of them by the use of drugs and illegal arms sales. Now, that's a very hasty overview, I realize, but I want to go on and make the other connections of where it moved from there. Briefly, Shackley and Kleins came back to run the Western Hemispheric program in 72 and 73, at the very time, incidentally, when we were trying to assassinate Allende in Chile. After 1973, they go back to Southeast Asia. By now, Shackley has been promoted to being the chief of covert operations for the Far East. They ran the infamous Phoenix program out of Vietnam, which killed literally thousands of civilians, non-combatant civilians. Some estimated as high as 60,000.
60,000.
At any rate, they were basically assassinating the infrastructure, teachers, clerks, mayors, anybody who might be able to run the country once the communists took over.
Same type of thing the Contras are doing, attempting to do in
Nicaragua.
In Nicaragua, exactly right. And there were military and intelligence people involved in it. There were also some of these so-called private teams that they were bringing in. But they're financing it not through official channels. When Vietnam finally shut down in 1975, rather than close this operation, by then they literally were hooked on a very heady operation which involves millions of dollars and really involves the creation of foreign policy, where you don't have to wait for those wimps in Congress. You simply fight fire with fire, all of that rationale. Rather than close it down in 1975, they moved it to Iran. And that's why when we have the present Iran arms scandal, you know, those folks didn't just parachute in with their cake and their Bible out of the blue. They went back to an old boy network which has been operating there for years. And part of it, again, involved an assassination program, killing the enemies of the Shah, any, quote, potential communists, which, as a matter of fact, probably did away with most of the democratic moderates, and thereby making it almost inevitable that only an Ayatollah, a religious fundamentalist, could get in to overcome the Shah. But at any rate, by 1978, many of these folks, Shackley and Kleins and others who are named in our lawsuit, Secord, Hakim, and so on, many of these folks went into the private sector. Secord, by the way, had moved into the Pentagon and become one of the chief procurement officers, so that he's getting these very large arms sales going to the companies that these folks had set up, the private companies that these folks had set up while they were in the agency. They then leave the agency and become the heads of companies that are benefiting from these arms deals. And what they're doing, basically, they had a number of skimming operations going on, but one of the chief ones was buying arms at their original cost and reselling them at replacement value. Sound familiar? And the difference, of course, was not paid back to the Pentagon. The difference went to Swiss bank accounts, and it then is used to fund these various operations. But in 1979, they began to move back into Central America, because in 79, you'll remember, we had the famous Harkin Amendment. Carter was in power, and he was emphasizing human rights. One of the people officially cut off from U.S. arms was Somoza in Nicaragua because of his violation of human rights. It was so gross that they couldn't avoid it. Not to worry, Somoza never missed a gun or a grenade, because these folks from the private sector, who in fact had all these government connections, simply moved in and began to supply even then. And of course, once Somoza fell, they began to deal with his generals, i.e. the Contras.
They set up the Contras, in effect.
Well, if they didn't set them up, they at least began to supply them and to arm them and to, carry on basically their shadow government, their foreign policy, no matter what Congress said. And when they could, they worked it back through government. When Reagan came into power, 1981, it was okay for the CIA to do this. So then they began to cooperate again with government sources. But by 83, wasn't it, they were caught mining the harbors. And the assassination manual, remember the assassination manual? Which said, go ahead and murder clerks, mayors, anybody in the infrastructure. It was the same crowd of people. In fact, one of the same agents who drafted that was later promoted upstairs to be the head of the CIA in Costa Rica.
So this team has been going in and out of the federal government.
That's right.
Some of their members were active high officials in the CIA and the military. Then during the Carter administration, quite a few of them left government service, did they not, to form more of a private network. And it was this network that Oliver North connected with to run both arms to the Contras and then to operate this drug ring that financed the operation. And these same folks brought the weapons to Iran.
It's precisely true. They turned to this same secret team when it was clear in 1983 that Congress was going to cut off money to the Contras, cut off the aid. No, the Boland Amendment said no direct or indirect military aid to the Contras. They met in the White House, Reagan, Bush, Meese, and Casey, and they decided we have to get around this congressional ban, and they turned to this same group of people. Oliver North was basically the manager of the program. He's not the boss. He's not the cowboy off the range like the Tower Commission report tried to paint it. Poindexter and North are good soldiers following orders. The signals came from the top. We are convinced that out of the violations of the Boland Amendment and other activities, there are clearly impeachable offenses for Reagan, Bush, and Meese. Casey is out already. But the signal was given. And they turned to the secret team went into action. Then you have the Iranian situation with the hostages. It's clear that the single most important hostage was a Mr. Buckley, who was the CIA station chief in Lebanon, who was kidnapped off the streets of Lebanon, taken to Iran, tortured, and made a massive confession to much of the kinds of activities that we are now discussing. They were desperate to get Buckley out, and part of the arms deal was an effort to say to the Iranians, we'll give you weapons, give us back Buckley. There is one story that has come our way, it's not confirmed in our view yet, that in fact Buckley gave a videotaped confession to the Iranians about all of this secret activity about which he was very familiar. He knew all of this stuff. And that the Iranians used the videotaped material to in fact blackmail the Reagan administration into sending the arms, that the arms are really hush money to the Iranians so that these videotapes don't go into circulation. But it is the same group of people, and it's an operation they're used to. They have planes available to them. They have arms merchants available to them. It was a simple matter to help the Israelis or get the Danish shipping groups or go to Portugal, wherever they had to go. They could service this need the government had to do a secret operation that the American people would have clearly rejected, as they did when they heard about it. Selling arms to the Ayatollah was perhaps the single most politically explosive thing that came out so far. I think when we get to the cocaine smuggling, that will overshadow it.
It's important to realize that these folks knew the drill because they had been doing it for years. I think it's very important to see the Contra effort and the present scandal in that larger context. We live in Washington. There's a lot of sentiment in Washington that, oh, this was just an aberration, and what we have to do is get it all behind us, much as we did, during Watergate. We made a great effort to get it all behind us, rather than to look at what's going on here. What is the pattern? Is this not perhaps a real constitutional crisis? These folks, I would maintain, are basically subversives. They're using the same logic that they used in Vietnam, where they said, we had to destroy the village in order to save it. They're saying we're willing to subvert democracy in order to save it. But it's totally violating the system of checks and balances that have been set up in this country, and I think they're subversives in the strict sense of that word.
Now, we've been talking kind of about the secret team and a group of CIA and ex-CIA people and some Pentagon people thrown in here and there. This makes it sound as if it's just kind of a renegade group operating kind of independently. Is it
Not
more
really.
possible that I can't imagine these activities going unknown and uncoordinated by the
That's right.
See, and that's
by
why
the
some of the
CIA.
history that I went into is important, because most of these folks were doing similar things while they were officials of government. Shackley and Kleins were CIA officials for years.
And go ahead.
Shackley, as a matter of fact, before he resigned, he was the head of covert operations for the entire world, appointed by George Bush, by the way, who is presently vice president. So, you know, these folks were doing it as officials of the government, and even now, the so-called private network, we know that it couldn't possibly operate without government approval. You know, fortunately, we had the Hassenfuss event in the plane that went down in Nicaragua in October, and poor Mr. Hassenfuss hit the ground talking and revealed the fact that he had been operating out of Ilopango Air Force Base, I mean, a military base in El Salvador. You don't get on that base without official Salvadoran government approval and U.S. approval. We now know from a number of sources that the government people knew and aided, they knew about this so-called private network. They aided and abetted it all up and down the line.
And there's another answer, too, to your question about the government had to know. At some points in this scenario, there are people in the government who are opposed to what's happening. But the people that are engaged in all of these racketeering and criminal activities are essentially gray-mailing the intelligence community, that if you try and stop me or arrest me or prosecute me, I'll tell about all that other stuff I did while I was in the government.
That we did while we were in it,
Yeah.
because the whole agency was doing things
Exactly.
in Vietnam and after.
That's right. So they have that kind of protection of being able to gray-mail the people that might otherwise stop them.
Yet it looks like the Reagan administration is engaging in a systematic process of damage control. They're trying to cover over the aspects of the Iran-Contra Gate scandal that you're trying to bring to light.
Well, as I mentioned, the Tower Commission report was essentially an effort to portray this as a momentary aberration. Some guys in the National Security Council just let it go to their heads and went out and did all these outrageous things. And we really just need to tighten up the procedures on the National Security Council so that they are not allowed to participate directly in covert operations, and that will cure the problem. And Oliver North and John Poindexter is an unfortunate incident in our national history, and we can put that behind us. Tower Commission said we don't know a whole lot about that Contra stuff, but others are going to look into that. Well, that was damage control. That was putting a spin on the story, that whole business of putting a spin on the story that's come out. I mean, they just like to take a reality and twist it. But that was damage control. Then they've appointed a special prosecutor, which is another part of the executive branch response to some extent to the crisis. But from what we understand, the special prosecutor is now looking at probably indicting Oliver North for having engaged in private activity on government time, thereby defrauding the government of his salary. That this was a private operation, this whole thing was private, and when Oliver North was off working on it, he was doing private stuff on government time. And they're worried about him using NSC stationery and things like that. So if ever there was a superficial approach to the problem, indicting Oliver North for embezzling the government, defrauding them of his time is a superficial approach. We are working with the staff of the special prosecutor. We are providing them with the information from our investigation and urging them to take a much broader view of the people, the events, and the historical context, because that's the only way we're going to solve the ultimate policy problem here. That's the executive branch. In the legislative branch, you have the Senate Select Committee, the House Select Committee, a little bit of activity in the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime. They are looking into the drugs. And the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is also looking into certain matters, but both of those have limited staffs. Neither of the other committees, other than the select committees, have the power to grant immunity to witnesses. So their investigations will go a certain distance, but not too far.
All of this is so interconnected that if they pursue any aspect of the investigation, they get to the story that you're trying to get out.
That's exactly right, and we're grateful for these different committees all looking into it. We think, however, that it's absolutely crucial that folks at the grassroots let their committee members know, their congresspeople, their senators know that they want the whole thing looked at, because obviously political people will do political things. Democrats love to show that some of this was abuse during a Republican administration. They aren't going to be too anxious to look at the broader picture, some of which happened under Democratic administrations. So we feel we're grateful that the congressional committees are going forward. We feel that it's very important that there be a civil suit such as ours in the private sector so that there is a kind of a check on Congress. And we also feel that it's extremely important that the citizens demand that people get to the bottom of this rather than get behind it. I mean, Congress will generally do more or less what the citizens demand that it does, and not much more.
Well, what is happening? How does this connect up with Howard Baker and his emergence as the president behind the scenes?
The president behind the scenes. I can tell you what we hear in Washington, and some of this is probably speculation. It just seems to make some sense. Once the scandal really began to break, the Republican Party went to Ronald Reagan and said, "You work for us. We're not going to go down the tubes over there. So we are going to start making some decisions here." Ronald Reagan wanted to put Mr. Gates as head of the CIA, a man who'd been involved in this whole situation.
Gates, who's
Deputy Director.
Oh, that's right.
Casey,
Okay.
Under Casey. They wanted
That's
to
right.
move him up when Casey went to the hospital. They blocked that. The Republican Party blocked that, said it will not be Gates. We will not risk the appearance of a cover-up. You must have someone of impeccable credentials and high credibility. The best they could find was William Webster from the FBI, who's now going through his confirmation process, and is probably, under the circumstances, the best person they could have come up with. Then he wanted to put Paul Laxalt in as his chief of staff to replace Don Regan. And they said no. Enough of the right-wing conservatives sitting and telling you what to do.
Laxalt also, according to Mother Jones and several other investigations, had connections with organized crime from some of his activities in Nevada.
I think
so. He's at least tarnished.
Right. I've read those
way.
stories. I think probably of far more concern to the Republican Party was the policy dimension. We have to get the White House out from under the control of these far-right adventurists who have gotten it into this mess.
Right.
So we want someone as your chief of staff who's a moderate Republican, impeccable credentials, untainted by the scandal, and they turn to Howard Baker. And there he is. Now, one of the stories floating about in Washington is that the ultimate damage control plan is that if Vice President Bush is forced to resign because of revelations about his involvement in this whole secret effort, then the plan would be to appoint Howard Baker as the vice president. Reagan is now being geared towards signing some arms control agreement with the Soviet Union. Enough of that right-wing evil empire stuff. Let's get an arms agreement, clean up your image historically, and let you go home and wait for the Nobel Peace Prize. So he does the agreement with the Soviets, and he retires gracefully from the presidency for whatever reason they think up, and Baker becomes the president. Then they move into 1988 with a moderate, untainted, incumbent candidate for the Republican Party, and they're in great shape. Now this, as I say, it's speculation, it's the Washington rumor mill, and you hear it through that. But it certainly makes a lot of sense. It also follows the pattern that Richard Nixon used. Agnew had to go, up came Ford. Nixon had to go, up came Ford. Ford goes in, no scandal other than the pardon of Nixon. But there he is.
Right. Bill, on this 1988 election issue, what is the evidence against Bush that makes it appear that he will be tainted by this scandal?
Well, of course, Bush is not one of the defendants in our lawsuit, but his name is coming up in many different ways. I think the most obvious one is his immediate connection with this so-called private network, something that was absolutely forbidden by the Boland Amendment, that they were not to help either directly or indirectly. We now know, because of the Hassenfuss plane and various other things, that a lot of it goes right back to George Bush's office. Donald Gregg, his assistant, was the man who, as a matter of fact, recruited Felix Rodriguez and some of these other operatives in the private network. I think a far bigger problem brewing for Mr. Bush is going to be the whole drug problem. He was, as I mentioned, in charge of the CIA at a time when apparently a lot of drug activity was taking place under official auspices out of Southeast Asia. He is now in charge of the National Strike Force on drugs. We've been told by various sources that what is happening, in fact, is that the strike force is cleaning up the drug traffic. That is to say, they're going out and busting the wildcatters and the entrepreneurs and the people who aren't online. So they're cleaning it up in that sense of creating a monopoly. And the main lines aren't being touched. I think that's going to be an increasing problem for Mr. Bush. If there is major drug traffic coming into this country, and obviously there is, and if some of it is being done under the auspices of these, Contra networks that he helped to set up, and he's in charge of the drug strike force, I think Mr. Bush is in a lot of trouble.
And didn't Bush, when he was head of the CIA, as you indicated earlier, appoint Shackley to a high CIA post who was involved in the drug trade in Vietnam?
Yes.
So there's another drug connection that Bush is involved with.
And I think you will see even more come out as time goes on. The task force on terrorism is going to be revealed to have a lot of people involved with it that eventually got caught up in the whole Oliver North secret network situation. So, I mean, those who really know what's happened could certainly sit down and say, well, George, if it all comes out, you're going to have to go, so we better be prepared to deal with that.
You know, there are other people involved in this framework which you're talking about, or there are interlocks or interconnects. The Covert Action Information Bulletin for this particular time period talks about the interconnects with the religious right, talks about General Singlaub and Oliver North being on the Board of Governors of the Council for National Policy, which is a right-wing organization, and Pat Robertson was the president.
Yeah, I think that's a very important element to feed in. I mentioned before in 1978 when people like Shackley and Kleins went into the private sector, they went into the private corporate sector. Shortly after that, we had General Singlaub getting fired from North Korea, remember, because of his effrontery to Carter. He went into a very interesting part of the private sector, that is the religious private sector. He became the head of a thing known as the World Anti-Communist League.
Right.
It received major funding from the Unification Church, the so-called Mooney Church. It is rabidly anti-communist. It is neo-Nazi in its mentality. It has direct ties with the death squads in Central America. There's an interesting book called Inside the League, by the way, which details a lot of this. But I think the thing that you touch on there, the right-wing religious motivation, is very important to keep in mind. I think when an Oliver North tells the press, you know, look up the 8th Beatitude, which is the one about, you know, blessed are those who are persecuted for justice' sake. Those folks aren't just manipulating religion. I think he really believes it. I think they see themselves as messianic figures who are stemming the tide of communism and you know, fighting against the evil empire. Notice how Reagan and many of his people have begun to use theological terms. I think they really believe that, and that in a way that's even more scary to be a true believer. They are able, therefore, to justify almost anything they do because they are the saviors of Western civilization, and they're fighting against the evil empire, i.e. communism.
And there is this whole framework of interconnects and organizations and structures with the religious right and the CIA and the mafia all throughout Central and South America.
Lanny said earlier, the combination of profiteering and patriotism is a very heady combination. That's true. When you add in a religious rationale, so whereby you become almost a crusader, a messianic figure, it's even more of a heady combination.
Now April the 11th, and the question that rises in my mind, how much of this story is going to get out? Do you see the media going into this, covering this, and what have you been trying to do to try to get the story out about the secret team and the truth behind the Iran-Contra scandal?
It's very difficult to get it out, but I will tell you, we're not going to stop until it is out. We don't want to have, you know, a resignation here or even an impeachment there. Somebody asked me in a talk that I gave, do I think this lawsuit will actually lead back to the impeachment of Reagan? And my answer was, why aim so low? And I wasn't being facetious. I really mean that. I think there are some of us now who are committed to not settling for this or that official going down. We want, and I think the American public wants to know what has been going on so that we can once again, you know, just maybe become a government of the people. One of the things that I might add, you asked about, you know, the media getting this out and so on. As a matter of fact, we named many of those names almost a year ago. We filed this lawsuit on May 29th, 1986, and hardly anyone noticed. Now, of course, partly due to the events of the time, like Kostenfuss and certainly the Iran scam, names like Secord and Hakim and Rob Owen and so on are much more, the lawsuit is being taken much, much more seriously. But it illustrates the fact that things don't get out until a climate builds up. I think there is no salvation for a democracy better than an informed public. As the public get more and more informed, then things like this lawsuit, like the other investigations that are going on, are much more likely to succeed.
We were talking about the media, or mentioning it. You tried to bring this information out on Nightline, Ted Koppel's program. Can you tell us what happened to you?
That was really a humorous event. They had a show called Viewpoint that was replacing Nightline, and it was about the press and the presidency, and are we bashing the president too much?
Yeah.
And this crazed group of media critics took it over for an hour, and we finally got a moment in to talk about the substance of the issue. And I said to Ted Koppel, I said, I don't believe you can possibly bash the presidency too much when the president has put in place a policy that results in massive amounts of cocaine being smuggled into this country. Well, Koppel just about fell out of his chair. He just couldn't handle it. He said, I've never heard anybody link the White House to cocaine. I mean, you've just done it on national television, but that doesn't, I just can't believe it. And I said, well, it's true, and we filed an affidavit in federal court in Miami in a lawsuit for the Christic Institute to say how it's been done and who did it. So it was a quick blip. But we knew it was coming, and we wanted to start telling people in this country
And it,
about what's
like the
been going
media
on.
usually do, they just blew it off.
We
It
gave him a
wasn't
copy
very-
of the affidavit for him to read, and he was asked later about it, and he said, well, I've never seen anything about the Christic Institute. And I know what's going on. It's a very hot potato. They don't want to touch it until someone else does first. We're getting there. Some of the major media are covering the story. It is getting out. I should also say that we are working through organizations and individuals all over the country to get this information out. We have formed a communications alliance of national organizations, religious denominations that have joined in to say, we will take your information and we will transmit it to the people we communicate with. The Communications Alliance now has organizations that talk to about 120 million people in this country. We are forming an advisory committee for our case, bringing on major religious leaders. We're working to get business leaders, labor leaders, other leaders onto that case to say this case is important and the American people should watch what's happening here, because here's what we're going to find out, where we're going to find out what's really going on in this country.
Now, there was this rather anomalous report on CBS and a longer treatment on West 52nd Street.
57th Street.
I missed that 5 blocks, if my math is right. But anyway, they actually did come out with a story on that we're talking about, the drugs and all, and the CIA.
And there will be more of that in
the
the near future.
However, it was not picked up by any of the other networks. It was not picked up by the New York Times or by the Washington Post.
That's right.
And that's the kernel of the establishment. You think that, first of all,
so-called
how did that
liberal-
story get out? The story's been there.
Yes.
Why did CBS just now do it, and why did the other media not pick it up?
That's a very complex question. A number of media people have told us the media doesn't really want to be out front. They love to be sort of close to the front, getting the scoops. But not, the media, major media anyhow, are basically weather vanes. They will say what they know people are ready to hear. I mean, for months they knew about the bombing of Cambodia and sat on it. Didn't bring it out until enough of a groundswell had built up in opposition to what we were doing in Southeast Asia. Then they tell the story. The groundswell, I think, is building. There are literally thousands of people, millions of people in this country who know that our Central America policy is bananas, if you'll, no pun intended. And it's building up to the point where I think the major media will be touching it soon. But why one group does it ahead of another, you'll notice that it was only a kind of a semi-independent organization within CBS that told that story. Washington Post and New York Times enjoy great reputations for being, liberal, investigative press. Frankly, we don't see much of that. I think they're much more into damage control than they are into investigative groundbreaking.
Well, they are the establishment press.
They get co-opted. They are the establishment press because the establishment is willing to talk to them on a regular basis. And that's corrosive of an independent press. I saw a piece a Newsweek person wrote in Newsweek saying there we were with Oliver North as a major source. And we knew a little bit about what he was doing, but we knew if we covered that, we'd lose him as a source for all these other things we were finding out. So rather than blow his cover, we kept him as a source. And that co-opted us into the government. So that kind of thing happens. It happens in lots of different ways. If the publisher of a major newspaper is consulted on a regular basis by the president or the president's staff as to what they're doing,
or intelligence agencies,
they feel they're part of the government, and that they don't want to cover stories that are going to cause a major upheaval in the country and threaten the stability of the process that they are such an important part of. There's another final piece on that for me. If ever there was a time the press should be responding, it's to this case we have filed and are litigating. Because here was a deliberate bombing of a press conference, a conscious strategy that if we kill United States journalists at a press conference and get it blamed on the Sandinista government, we will have achieved a turning of the American political sentiment against the Nicaraguans. And we will use these members of the journalistic community as our pawns to achieve that political end. And they were building off of something that had happened in Nicaragua under Somoza, where Somoza's National Guard killed a United States journalist, just murdered him on the street. And the American people turned against Somoza. So they said, hey, that's the scenario. Let's kill American journalists, make them think the Sandinistas did it, and turn them against the Sandinistas. Well, if any community in this country has a stake in what we're doing, it's the journalistic community. And if there ever was a time, here we are in the 200th anniversary of the United States Constitution. We're looking at the press, the free press, the First Amendment, and a direct attack upon them that threatens their ability to gather news without becoming targets. It's a perfect time for them to step forward and say, okay, we're going to be embraced by the Constitution, and we're going to embrace the Constitution. We're going to tell you the truth about what's going on in this country and the world so that you can use the constitutional system to make it right. So you can be an informed electorate, giving your informed consent to policies that are going on and not have any policies going on that don't have your informed consent.
I might note that the Christic Institute has published an affidavit of Daniel Sheehan, who's one of the members of your group, that gives all the information on the shove that we've covered today, that goes into the whole history of the secret team.
It basically tells what it is we know and how we came to know it.
And it's available to the public. How can people get in touch with the Christic Institute and find out about your work and the information that you have?
We're in Washington, D.C. The address there, if folks want to write, is 1324 North Capitol Street in Washington, D.C. And the zip is 20002. So folks can write to us and receive that, or write to us and be listed on, be regular recipients of updates on this case.
Do you have a phone number there, too?
Yes, it's area 202-797-8106.
And to conclude in the minute or so we have left, what's the next step for the trial?
Well, we're presently in the stage that's known as discovery. It means that the judge has now ruled it's a valid suit legally. We now have subpoena power, not just over these individuals, but over documents, very wide subpoena power because of the racketeering law. He said that the racketeering claim prevails, so all of their motions to dismiss the suit have been denied. We have now begun to take depositions, and that will go on for some time. The trial may not happen for a year or more, but the important thing is that this discovery period will all be available to the public.
We see a tremendous opportunity here. Whatever the select committees do on the Congress, whatever the special prosecutor does, this case is like a plow. It's opening up the ground and showing what's going on in this secret network, in these covert wars, this foreign policy carried out through racketeering and criminal activity. And we're offering the American people an opportunity to change that policy. It's something they didn't have in Watergate. You know, Nixon resigned, everybody went, that's over. They didn't have it in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was stopped, but no one ever really got a handle on what went on there. Here is the opportunity to see how the constitutional processes are being avoided, how democracy is being subverted, as Father Davis said, and to make the changes, the fundamental policy changes that are necessary to prevent this from happening again. That's what we see as our goal.
The next 6 months or so, the next year, is going to be very critical in the history of the United States because If we're ever really going to be a government of the people have to know how power is being exercised.
Our audio man was Richard Jones. And of course, a big thank you to Austin Community Television, ACTV, for the use of their equipment. Alternative Views is a production of the Alternative Information Network, P.O. Box 7279, Austin, Texas, 78713.